Hello listeners, and welcome to the Montel Weekly Podcast. Normally, we'd bring you energy matters in an informal setting. But today, we're at eWorld, the huge gathering of the energy sector in Essen, Germany. As befitting the context, we're going to focus on Germany in this episode. The country has been at the forefront of the expansion of renewables. And last year, over half of the country's electricity demand was met by wind and solar power, a quite astonishing achievement. But there are headwinds. And if the energy transition has to succeed more generally, it has to succeed in Germany. Joining me, Richard Sverrisson, are Hans Koenig of Aurora Energy. A warm welcome to you, Hans.
Thank you very much for having me.
Tobias Federico of Energy Brainpool, now part of the Montel Group. A warm welcome to you.
Thank you, Richard.
And Henning Gloystein of Eurasia Group. A warm welcome to you, Henning.
Thank you.
Henning, I'd like to start with you, really, because, this pod, the idea came from a discussion we had several weeks ago when you were talking about Germany has had epic problems, but has also found epic solutions to those problems. Could you explain a bit by what you meant there?
Yeah, thanks. So I actually think there's been a little bit too much negativity around this. Now, I know that there was a price shock, which is probably equivalent to a heart attack in 2022. Power prices, gas prices, coal prices, everything went through the roof. And had prices stayed that high, a lot of companies in Germany would have gone bust. There would have been this famed or much touted deindustrialization. But that hasn't happened on this scale. Yes, of course, there's a recession and the energy-intensive industry has scaled back. But the government support for heavy industry and for consumers has been quite remarkable. And not just the German government support, there's been solidarity across Europe. The Spanish government started to put limits on cooling in their cinemas in 2022 before the German government put any thermostat rulings into place. There was new pipelines built for reverse capacity to start bringing LNG from France to Germany before Germany could build its own LNG import terminals. Germany now has 3 LNG import terminals. The Dutch built another 2 in the same time. And the efficiency gains that German industry and the Dutch industry and across Europe have been made in the last 2 years are astonishing. And these are gains that will never be given back. Once you make those gains, you become more efficient and smarter in your energy use. You will maintain them. And we've seen that with clients across the world who now look at industries in Europe and think, goodness me, these guys have put into place efficiency gains that we were planning to do in like 5 to 10 years. And it's still hurting. Germany is still in a recession. 2024 will not be a boom year, without a doubt. And there's still problems. But there has been a lot of problems have been resolved. And had we sat here in February 2022, I mean, the invasion of Ukraine is 2 years old this week. Had we been here 2 years ago and said, shortly after invasion, it's like, if the Russians cut all gas supply, Germany will be through the worst within 2 years, I think we'd have all been considered mad. And I think that's worth keeping in mind, that a lot of the problems have been resolved. There's a lot of other problems that will have to be resolved. There's price issues, the fiscal stress, which I'm sure we'll come to discuss. So that we're kind of halfway there, but we are halfway there. So I'm a glass half full kind of person.
But in a sense, though, Henning, the problems, we can say this with the benefit of hindsight, that the problems were of Germany's own making. The reliance on Russian gas, exiting coal plants or coal burning at the same time as nuclear. So some of these were created by the country itself.
Absolutely. So yes, you do have some of the, you mentioned epic problems were house-made, and some of the epic solutions also house-made. So Germany seems to have this thing of creating pretty big problems for itself and then resolving them rather fast. But in a perfect world, you wouldn't have the problems in the first place. Should Germany never have imported Russian gas? I mean, I think it's, Germany is in the proximity of Russia, and in a normal world, Russia should be supplying gas. But should it have been 2 pipelines, Nord Stream 1 and 2? Maybe not, probably not. Was the reliance too big? Yes. And should you have done a double U-turn on the nuclear exit? Probably not. And is the coal policy a bit of a mixed bag and confused? Yes. So I agree that there are a lot of mistakes have been made as well. But it is amazing when you are faced with an existential crisis. how fast solutions can be found if you really have to do it. And you actually, in a bit of a smaller scale, you saw that this late last year when the German budget crisis erupted, another house-made crisis. The Sondervermögen, it's not like Germany doesn't have the ability to raise debt or to finance these projects. It's just the way they've done it. The government was basically caught out cooking their books in a weird way. And the Constitutional Court said, no, you have to stop doing this. So it required a sharpening of thinking by the German government on where you focus your priorities. What are they? And they did it in the short term, and they're going to have to do it again this year, next year as well. But the solutions are there. We kind of know what we'll need to do, and I'm again moderately optimistic that we'll find the right solutions.
Do you share that sense of optimism here, Hans, and that we should be looking at the glass that should be half full rather than half empty? I mean, we're aware that there are certain problems within the energy market in the country, but there are many bright spots as well, right?
Absolutely. So I would distinguish slightly between getting through the crisis of the past 2 years and now what's ahead of us, the challenge of actually implementing the energy transition, because we're still not very far. As you mentioned, we're just above 50% of electricity demand renewable last year, but of course shares are much lower in the other sectors, in heating, in industry, in transportation, and so forth. And that is the huge challenge that is still ahead of us. In a way, getting to very high renewable share in the power sector, that is the easy bit. So I would say yes, we got through the energy crisis almost spectacularly well. No one would have, or very few would have thought it would go that well. We were also a little bit lucky because we've had 2 relatively warm winters. I think that also has to be said. But in that regard, we're in a very good place. But in terms of what's ahead of us, so getting all these renewables built, accelerating the permitting, getting the grids built in a cost-effective way, and preventing grid fees for consumers from going through the roof. I think those are, even within the power sector, are huge challenges that are ahead of us. And then the other big challenges are in transportation, where German industry isn't well prepared for the electrification of transport, and Chinese manufacturers are coming for the German OEMs with force. And then in industry, we will really struggle to maintain a couple of very energy-intensive activities, which we are currently doing. Things like producing ammonia, producing methanol, producing steel. These are things that will be more economical to do in other places, and we will have to have a really tough discussion about which of these things can we keep here. Which of these should we subsidize in the longer term for strategic reasons, for security of supply reasons potentially, and which of these do we let go, and what can we build in its stead? So I do think we have huge challenges ahead of us, despite the fact that we got through the past 2 years in a relatively good way.
Tobias, if I can turn to you and ask, I mean, a lot of the issues that Hans talked about here, we've been talking about for years and years. I mean, the expansion of renewables, the grids. There are a lot of challenges, as Hans mentioned, but there are some bright spots as well. So there's a balance of the two, is there not?
Definitely it is. I mean, we passed the crisis. I would not agree that all problems are house-made, because when you want to make a energy turnaround from a fossil-driven electricity production, you have to steer somehow if the market doesn't steer it. And that's why we needed to have this coal phase out. The coal phase out itself was much more a change in, let's say, economic development in certain regions where especially lignite mining was focused. That's why the focus was not on becoming climate neutral up to 2038, which was in the beginning, now 2030, rather to make an economic transition in those regions. On the other hand, we had the issue also regarding the debt and debt part. Increasing state debt is something where Germans have their problems with, I would say in general. And the weird thing is now everybody is talking about, okay, let's get rid of this law and increase our debt at high interest rate. And in the period where we had really low interest rate in Germany, especially as the state had negative interest rates, nothing has really been done. In combination with that we are seeing the governmental plans of changing the design, supporting renewables, is mostly by payment from the governments when we look into CFDs as an example. So I think it's always a question of the perspective. When you are in the government and you want to steer things, you have to make decisions which afterwards seem to be a mistake. But on the other hand, the German economic growth was always based on cheap energy. Or rather, in the beginning it was the lignite and coal, which was quite cheap in Germany. Later on it was Russian gas. And in the future it might be renewable energy, but the in-between time now is definitely an issue for Germany.
The German government recently published its power plant strategy. You know, we've been waiting a long time for the details to emerge. What's your verdict on that plan?
Well, it's a half glass. It's not a full glass. I mean, we have been expecting 25 gigawatt of gas turbines or CCGT power plants. Either they're going to be fired by natural gas or by hydrogen or green hydrogen. Now it's additional support of 10 gigawatt from the government. I think if we would not have had this constitutional decision there, it would have been 25. This is one thing. And of course, they're looking into a capacity market, which somehow makes sense to incentivize investors. The question is, how is the detailed design? And unfortunately, it was just a press release. So not a lot of details there, so we don't know how the design will be. And I think it will be the fourth or fifth cycle of let's introduce a capacity market into Germany. So let's see. But in the end, it's only a small portion of that what should have been done.
What's your view here, Hans? I mean, 10 gigawatts of hydrogen-ready gas plants. I think that, for me, that's quite a crucial part of it. I mean, are they ever going to be hydrogen-ready, or is it just another excuse to burn more gas? And or I should maybe say, it's the fear is that you could lock in the future to a dependence on fossil fuel gas, rather.
Well, I think obviously burning gas is not an end in itself. The end is keeping the lights on, and I think if you take that as the ultimate goal, then what we now have as a compromise is probably more sensible than what was initially being discussed, the more or less 25 gigawatts, of which around 10 would have been hydrogen fired, and that would have been extremely expensive in terms of like subsidizing this, or even over the next couple of years. So we've cut out the more expensive parts of the strategy and focused on the things that really keep the lights on, and that, from my perspective, is quite understandable, because if you count, if you calculate the abatement costs of these 9 gigawatts of hydrogen power plants we would have built, it would have been astronomical. It's really, in my view, a rationalization and a focus on the question of security of supply. What do we really need? We need things that are flexible, that are dispatchable, that are relatively low carbon, and that will, over time, run less and less as more and more renewables are being built. The question is then, what do they ultimately switch to? And do we have to regulate that now? In a way, we have a European emissions trading system. If you just extrapolate the linear reduction factor with which new EUAs that are given into the market every year are currently declining, you end up with zero in 2040. And when there's no more emission certificate, there's no more carbon these plants can run on, right? So if we keep the system, and if we stick with that, we've got the mechanism for conversion to something carbon neutral built in. Will that be hydrogen? Will that be ammonia? Will that be something else? I don't think we necessarily need to specify that. We just need to keep faith in we need to keep the European emissions trading system credible. Is probably a better way of putting it.
I mean, Hans alluded to there, that we've talked a lot in the last sort of 10, 15, 20 years about the key pillars of the market, which are competitiveness, security of supply and decarbonisation. We seem to be falling back on security of supply now, which is in the wake of the energy crisis, which is very understandable. But Hans also alluded to industry, and there's prospects, this talk of potential deindustrialization or more focus on what actually works for Germany. What's your view here, Henning?
So the energy-intensive industry, especially some of the ammonia production that you mentioned earlier, is a problem, because that worked well when gas was cheap and abundant. If you look at the chemical plus pharmaceutical industry in 2021, they contributed about 2% to German GDP. but they consume something like 15% of German natural gas. And that just isn't feasible at this stage. We don't have as much gas in the market available right now as we did have a few years ago, and the gas that is there is more expensive. So we have to have the discussion on, in the long term, does Germany need to be a major fertilizer producer, or pulp, or glass, or can German companies invest elsewhere? Could be in China, that's a bit unpopular now as well, but could be in the Middle East, could be in the United States, and then free up energy to reinvest, literally free up energy to reinvest into growth sectors, which is actually happening. If you look at the manufacturing output in Germany, it's not great as overall, but there is actually growth in employment and in capacity expansion, whether it's batteries, whether it's optics, robotics, electric vehicles, obviously. And of course now we have a major expansion in defense spending, which is actually, we're here in the Rhine-Ruhr area. Rheinmetall sits in Düsseldorf. Look at their share price. I mean, a lot of the defense spending that's happening in Europe now will actually be going to German companies. So there's a restructuring going on here, and it's an important one. That's not to say, though, that we need to get rid of all our chemical production. These are strategically important jobs. As we know now, supply chain security matters. We don't want to outsource everything. There is this friend-shoring, reshoring debate. So we do need some base industrial output in Germany, at least that's our view, or my personal view as well, to make chemicals, to make steel, to make cement here. You can see in some countries in Europe what happens if that capability goes. And so I live in Britain. There's a big discussion now whether Britain uses its virgin steel production, whether they don't have the capabilities anymore. And I think that's a major mistake. And that Germany and most European nations should try and avoid. But we do need to look at some of the most basic core products and just need to decide whether they have a feasible future to be made in Germany in the next 20 years, including in a net zero goal, because they're carbon intensive products as well.
Hans.
One thing to that, because that I think you strike on a very important point, because it's really two debates we're having here. So it's on the one hand there's the question of what can we maintain in a climate neutral world, and then there's the question what can we maintain even before that, because the main thing German industry, German heavy industry, energy intensive industry is currently grappling with, it's not the energy transition policies, it's the fact that energy in the US is extremely cheap. And if you're competing with gas at $2 per MMBTU, that is extremely difficult to do in Europe with or without Russian gas. So I think a lot of the issues German industry is currently having is really a function of this extremely cheap energy in the US, which is of course on top of that you have the IRA subsidies, right? And it's that thing and not climate policy. That is also creating challenges, but the two are often mixed in the public debate, which I think we need to be careful to do.
I would even increase the discussion a little bit, because when we are talking about German economic growth and deindustrialization, obviously coming from the wholesale market, we are looking in the energy-intensive industry. But the backbone of German economy and German growth rate are the mid-sized industries. And they are feeling the competition regarding the US-American market, but they cannot escape into those markets. They don't have the financial capabilities. So high energy prices are for them an issue. Decreasing labor force, that's definitely an issue too. So I think we have a mixed picture here. One is of course energy related, but the other one is a general economic development, and getting new labor forces is really an issue for those small, medium-sized industries, which are also accountable to one third of the energy demand, at least the electricity demand in Germany.
So you'd say the fate of these small, medium-sized enterprises, that's the famed German Mittelstand, right? Yeah. Their fate is more concerning than, say, that of large, heavy industry.
Well, let's say so. We often look into large heavy industry, and we have the energy drain and the economic drain. They go to the cheaper countries like the Middle East or the US, and they have the financial capacities to do so. And they are in international markets playing and producing. But the famous Mittelstand, they see the international market competition, but they don't have the chance to get out of Germany. So the only exit they have to reduce their production, or in the end to fail bankruptcy.
Absolutely. So over to you then, Henning, and let's talk and go back to renewables and the expansion of renewables. How should Germany roll out? It's done very well, but there's still, as you said, there are challenges, as we've discussed, ahead. How can this be sped up?
I mean, when you said earlier that Germany now produces 50% of its, or meets 50% of its electricity demand from renewables, that's remarkable, but it is also still one of the biggest coal burners in Europe. And yes, there's the exit goal for 2030, which is ambitious, but we hinted at it before. To support all the renewable build-out, first of all, we need to invest into overcapacity in renewables. That is one way to get rid of the intermittency issues. Like you can see this in the North Sea basin. Just build a lot of offshore wind capacity so that there's a little bit of wind everywhere. Costs a lot of money. Then we need intermittency solutions, and we've got the 10 gigawatt clean gas, hydrogen capacity coming up. I agree that we should probably not build a regulation and force stuff now into law that we might not be able to live up to in the 2030s. So I think we'll have to wait and see a little bit on whether we run them on natural gas that in some form use CCS, which still has to be deployed at scale, or whether it is hydrogen that goes into the turbines. But we'll have to wait and see. But we don't have to decide that now. And Germany is a big enough economy, big enough country that can actually rely on several solutions. So, here in the Ruhr area, there's so many brownfield sites available where you can build big batteries. Germany, luckily, is, if you look at a map, it's got 9 land borders. It's got access to interconnections with the Alpine hydro reservoirs, the Nordics, in France, nuclear power, which the Germans don't like, but it's there, and in Eastern Europe and Central and Eastern Europe as well. So. You can actually build a portfolio of solutions here, and that's, I think, what Germany needs to do, because the country is big. That's a disadvantage in the sense that the landlocked part of the south doesn't have access to LNG and offshore wind, but it is also that south is close to the Alps and close to France and close to southeastern Europe. So it's big enough and the economy is strong enough that there's the availability of several options, and we don't need to decide them all right now.
Would one possible solution be, which is often talked about, splitting the German wholesale price zone into 2 or more, or joining with neighbours? Hans, what's your view here?
So I don't think it would help with renewables build-out, right? For renewables, just viewing them in isolation, it's actually an additional risk which needs to be accounted for. But though I do think that risk could be managed through clever policy, I would almost turn it around and ask: can we conceive of a decarbonized German electricity system which doesn't have much stronger local incentives to consume, especially electricity, then when it's abundant, but also then when also the grids can get it to you. To give a concrete example, where we're going into a world where we'll have tens of millions of electric vehicles, and they will, even technically they all have that now, but not everyone is doing this. They will have the capability to charge in a smart way. So charge when electricity is cheap. So under the current system, you'll have tens of millions of vehicles also in the south, and they will charge when it's windy, because power prices will tend to be low when it's windy, when all the offshore and onshore wind parks in northern Germany are producing. Thereby, they would increase the already existing grid bottleneck we have in the middle of Germany, and which is not going away, by the way. And they would then need to be redispatched out again by the grid operators, or we need to ramp up gas-fired power plants to then charge these EVs, because we can't actually get the wind electricity down south where all these EVs are charging, right? So we're going into a world where we have huge amounts of flexible demand, and we need to create incentives for flexible demand to behave in a system-friendly way and to not increase grid bottlenecks over what we'll have anyway, right? Managing the grid will be challenging anyway. If we create the wrong incentives, it will be much harder. So in the longer term, I don't think we can get around building these stronger local incentives, and splitting a price zone is only one way of doing that, though the standard European way of doing that. There's things to be managed around that. You need to find a solution for the energy-intensive industry in the south. You need to find a solution for subsidy-free offshore wind parks in the North Sea, which may no longer be viable under a split. And these are very real issues that need to that need to be worked on. However, just looking at it from the end, I don't think we can have a decarbonized system that doesn't have these local signals. So we better get going.
Absolutely. What's your view, Tobias? I mean, is it all about the grid expansion, both local and the high voltage network? And how do we then boost that green growth that's so desired and needed? Is it all about flexibility?
Well, yeah, it is. I mean, we have flexible production, or let's say unplannable production, and that's why we have to be in accordance with the demand, in accordance with the production itself. Looking into the price zones, I don't think that this is a solution that remembers me of when you have a hammer in a hand, every problem is a nail. And we have been discussing regarding price zones all the time, and we see that zonal pricing does not increase investments into cross-border capacities. It does not make incentives really into renewables investments. It steers a little bit, but look into Norway, what happens with North Norway and South Norway. So, and here we have zonal pricing since 30 years. So therefore, the thing is, what's the value of electricity when we have scarcity or when we have an overproduction? And we have to generate a price signal, which we see in the spot market, we see in the intraday market, but we don't see it on the end user level. And lifting flexible demand, which is one of our also scenarios where we have, of course, an increase of flexible demand. That's the new demand with more price signals. That's a solution. But on the other hand, when you look into this zonally as a whole country price zone, then we don't look at our blind spot, which is the grid and grid expansion. So there we have to do a lot of work and a lot of investment, which on a high interest rate level is difficult.
And it's proceeding at snail's pace as well over the last 10, 15 years. A lot needs to be done.
Is there something slower than a snail?
Yeah,
so that's grid expansion.
Yeah, slug, maybe. Yeah. Henning?
Yeah, just to add to the problems for it, so I mean, I can see some of the arguments for a split price zone in Germany, because the north they have offshore wind, they have access to gas, they're connected to the Nordic and the Benelux market, so you can see where they're coming from. Say, well, why shouldn't we benefit from cheaper electricity? And then in the south they have higher electricity prices. But in Germany, I think this is totally unfeasible, because things like Länderfinanzausgleich will break down over this. If Baden-Württemberg and Bayern suddenly have electricity prices 3 times as high as in northern Germany, they will stop sending financial aid to northern Germany and to eastern Germany. And so the federal policy nature of Germany, I don't think allows for breaking up the German power price market. So I actually don't think it's a realistic debate. And I'd agree here, because we've had this debate for ages and nothing is moving in that way. So what Germany needs to do is, and you were alluding to this a bit earlier, saying we need incentives to invest into local clean capacity. Like, first of all, for security of supply, politically and economically, if fossil fuel import prices are high and the reliability of supply is low, i.e. there's disruption, the incentive economically and politically is to invest into clean local capacity. It'll cost a lot of money, which is more difficult now because of high interest rates and fiscal stress, but that is the long-term solution. And you can see in Germany there's local issues around this. Southern Germany now, if you have a major production project that requires the equivalent power capacity of, let's say, 200 megawatt, you will not be able to build that in the next 5 or 10 years because there's not enough capacity. This is why all these investments are going to northern Germany or central Germany, roughly north of Frankfurt, because there is capacity.
Being access to the grid.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And this requires what you said a bit earlier. It requires local incentives to get access to capacity somehow.
Absolutely.
And I don't think it is by splitting the market.
No. Fair enough. Hans, so a final word from you, I think, on this matter.
Just to be not misunderstood on this point, I'm not saying we don't need grid expansion. We do need grid expansion, massive amounts of it, but we cannot build enough grid to transport all electricity we need if we don't manage demand in a smart way. We'll have more than 100 gigawatt of flexible electricity demand in the south. Each high voltage line we're building from north to south has 2 or 4 gigawatts of capacity, right? So we would need 20, 30, 40 of these lines if we mismanage the flexibility of demand, and that simply cannot be done. So we need both expansion and smart flexibility.
I could go on for hours here talking about this. I think we only just scratched the surface, but I think we covered the main points. So I think we have to round off there, and I'll have to let you guys go off and join this trade fair in Essen. But thank you very much, Hans, Henning and Tobias for being guests on the Montel Weekly podcast.